Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one we have a few advances by the Russians in the direction of Selydove, where the toughest fighting is currently taking place, as the Russians are looking to gain full control over the settlement over the next few days. Some advances south of Sukarine, and some fighting in the Toretsk direction. Starting out to the direction of Novoselidivka and Ismailivka, the Russians have moved to the south of the river line, moving the direction of Hirenik to the east, and the southern parts of Novoselidivka by the southern bank of the Solenki river line. The Russians have with this reached the outskirts of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians south of Novoselidivka. The Russians will look to gain full control over the settlement here in the western parts and move towards Hirenik in the eastern parts, gaining control over the fortified positions, moving down south to the Vovcha river line near Kudachove and along the railways down south to Berestki. This is combined with the recent battles in the west of Sukarine towards Novodimitrivka and the fortified positions. It is clear that the Russian objective is to gain control over the southern flank of Selydove by launching several operations west of Sukarine and south of the settlement, using it as a springboard to capture the fortified positions of the Ukrainians and the surrounding settlements. In the direction of Selydove itself, the Russians have advanced further within the central parts of the settlement in the southern direction, and in the northern flank, the Russians are flanking the Ukrainian positions along the final escape route out of the settlement and entering the fortified positions along the high-rise apartment complexes in the northern parts of the settlement. In the southern section of the settlement, zooming in, we see that the apartment complex area, which was just a small area, is now under Russian control. The hospital area in the southeast, the farm area in the south. This leaves only the residential area in the western parts of the southern part of the settlement. We see that it is largely just a residential area that is split across right here with this borderline, with the river line in the north and the river line in the west. The Russians have already passed the western parts by reaching Vishneve. This means that largely this area is mostly clear of Ukrainian soldiers. What was there has likely retreated back to Vishneve or the northern parts. This is to avoid an encirclement, which has practically already happened because any attempt to withdraw would be through Russian lines. There is this northern road between the north and southern bank of the river line, which the Ukrainians can still make use of, although it is close to Russian firing positions, so it will be a very dangerous trip, but it's still possible. Therefore, we see that the southern part will likely fall fairly soon, considering the defensive positions here are very difficult to defend. The Russians have quickly captured territory in the southern parts, where their largest advances have taken place. In the northern parts, it is clear that the apartment complex area is much more difficult to push through. This is why we're seeing, with the flanking maneuver of the Russians in the northern section of the front line, it is clear that the Russians are here looking to gain full control of the western outskirts of Selydove, both in the northern and southern flank. This is to completely encircle the apartment complex area where the majority of the Ukrainian forces are present. The objective here is for the Russians to now pressure the Ukrainian positions in the north, pushing them into the apartment complex area, and doing the same in the eastern direction, where they are looking to push as many Ukrainian soldiers as possible into the apartment complex area before they close the lid with the push in the northern flank. This makes it very clear that Selydove, although the Ukrainian defenses of the city has pretty much collapsed, the Russians are looking to gain control over it in the next few days. There is still a significant presence of Ukrainian soldiers. They are likely all centered around the apartment complex area. This means that although the Russians will likely close the gap here between the northern and southern flanks fairly quickly, or may leave it open, keeping it under strict fire control, the city itself will not fall into Russian hands until they have cleared the apartment complex areas. This means that the Russians will continue fighting over Selydove until it has been completely cleared, similar to Volodar, where there will be no significant breakthrough following the city. However, we also see that the fortified positions of the Ukrainians have a massive gap here west of Selydove, this entire area is almost completely free of fortified positions. So with this, it is clear that the Russians will launch offensive operations continuously west of Selydove, following the capture of the settlement, and it will open up for a new large offensive here in the southern flank of Pokrovsk. We see that once the Russians reach the outskirts of Pokrovsk in the east, both Mirnorad and Pokrovsk, their advances largely stopped. There's only a few positional fighting here and there. But in the Selydove direction, we'll see that it will likely be a similar case where the Russians will align the front line along the outskirts of Pokrovsk and move in the western direction to capture the fortified line here west of Selydove to prevent the Ukrainians from expanding it and covering their flanks, to take advantage of the fact that they are flanking these fortified positions from the east, their weak point and their rear, to then push through, gaining control over this defensive line, separating Pokrovsk from Kudahova completely, and taking advantage of the situation to use Selydove as a forward position and springboard for offensive operations in the direction of Kudahova from the north. This will be a push from the northern direction of Selydove towards Novodimitrivka, combined with assaults from the east from Sukarine, and continuing down south towards Sunsivivka, where we see that this settlement is one of the larger ones with the Solona River going through it. This means it will act as a defensive line for further offensive operations down south and a strong flank for operations in the western direction. It will likely be that the Russians will have this Selydove as a step 1, capturing that, move down south towards Novodimitrivka and getting a foothold in the fortified positions as step 2, and then down south towards Sunsivka, Soria, and capturing the fortified positions as step 3, to then push down south in the direction of Kudahova, capturing and closing off the western flank as step 4. The Russian objective is not to completely close off the gap yet, but to force the Ukrainians to withdraw due to the lack of supplies and difficulty holding their positions, and then hitting the Ukrainian soldiers while they are on the move. Gaining control over the northern bank of the Vovcha river line will create a much stronger position for the Russians to then push towards Kudahova, both with fire control from the northern bank as well as pushing in from the eastern and western flanks of Kudahova to then gain control over the settlement. Moving up to the Toretsk direction, we have an assault by the Russians towards Sherbinivka and in the eastern parts of Toretsk, while the Ukrainians have recaptured large parts of the district south of Toretsk. Starting out in the Sherbinivka direction, we see that the Russians are moving along the Krivotoretsk river, moving into the settlement of Sherbinivka, and the objective is clearly to flank the Ukrainian fortified positions here in the western parts. The Ukrainians have strong positions along the industrial area and the hills here in the western parts of Toretsk. Cutting off the supplies by capturing Sherbinivka would force the Ukrainians to withdraw up in a northern direction towards the northern parts of Toretsk due to the fortified positions being in danger of fighting taking place there, as the Russians, if they gain control over those, will have fortified positions overlooking the city and force the Ukrainians to withdraw from it completely. So heavy fighting by Sherbinivka is very dangerous for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have made use and advantage of the Russian redirection to recapture parts in the southern district. The objective here is to flank the Russian positions and cut off their head at the push through towards Leonidivka and Sherbinivka. The objective is to make use of the high ground to cut off the supply roads going towards the north and to make use of the fortified positions under their control in the east. Securing the eastern flank by recapturing large parts of the district south of Toretsk allows the Ukrainians to have a better position for such an operation. Thinking about it clearly, we see that fortified positions likely have defensive units and limited offensive capabilities. The same with the western parts. However, if the Ukrainians send necessary troops as reinforcements, they'll be able to launch such an operation. It's unlikely that they have such units in reserve, considering that they redirected assault units like the 47th Mechanized Brigade to the Kursk direction instead. We see in the eastern parts of Toretsk the Russians made a small advance along the residential area. It is clear that they continue fighting along the central parts of the city as well, with the main focus around the apartment complex area and the industrial zone, which is the core of the Ukrainian defensive positions here in Toretsk. If the Russians gain control over those parts in the central parts and gain control of Chervenivka, then the Ukrainian positions in the district in the south and the fortified positions will be completely cut off from any supplies, and they will not be able to withdraw without being under heavy fire. And that will lead to the Russians reaching the fortified positions in the western outskirts of Toretsk and to move on to the industrial area in the northern parts by Krymske and move on to the western outskirts of the settlement as well. Based on that, we can see that this is the decisive battles over the city of Toretsk, the fighting over Chervenivka in the west, the apartment complex and industrial area in the center, and Krymske in the north, where the fighting is now undergoing in Chervenivka and the central parts of Toretsk. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, YouTube membership, PayPal link down in the description for donations. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.